Hello and welcome back to another video today here again on Forza Horizon 5 to take a look at another of the brand new real cars from the Hot Wheels expansion. I have taken a look at the Brabham and the Hennessy so far, as well as a few of the Hot Wheels made-up cars, if you like, but today I'm going to be taking a look at this rather extreme Schuppan 962CR, which looks even more extreme when everything is opened here in Forza Vista. And you might be able to tell, it's pretty much a Le Mans racing car, except it's road legal. And there's really not all that much space in the cabin. Look how close the two seats are. And yeah, again, in here you can very easily tell it's basically a racing car. These were built between 1992 and 1994 by Australian racing driver Vern Schuppan, who used to race Porsche 962s at Le Mans, which is actually what this is based on, which is why it's quite so extreme and probably explains why on the motorway here in Forza on the downhill section it can hit 226 miles an hour, which would normally be a lot for a racing car, but not for a Le Mans racing car, with that track's ridiculously long straight having to be taken into account when designing one of these. It rather unsurprisingly handles very well too, with amazing levels of grip, although it does have a tendency to understeer a little bit, probably given the downforce. It kind of goes that way rather than oversteering, let's say. So, although the company was set up by an Australian, it's actually assembled in Buckinghamshire here in the UK, which is why here in Forza it comes under the UK as a country for this brand. Funding for the project, though, came from Japanese investors who eventually failed to pay what they were supposed to, and that, along with the high cost of building this car, meant that the company went bankrupt and folded, with only 6 of them ever having been produced in those few years. And I was actually lucky enough to see one of these at a car show locally to me a few weeks ago, which I don't think I'd realised quite how rare it was at the time. I knew there weren't many, but I didn't think there were as few as 6. It is, of course, as I said, based on a racing car, meaning it's fairly powerful and quite light, producing 600 horsepower from a 3.3-litre flat-six turbocharged engine, which, being from the early 90s, suffers from quite horrendous, actually, turbo lag, particularly in first gear, and it weighs just over 1,000 kilos, which means here in Forza it puts it at S1 869 from standard. So I think building it to the top of S1 and going for some online racing might be quite a good idea. In terms of the available upgrades, there is one engine swap, which is another flat six, presumably from another type of Porsche. There's an all-wheel drive drivetrain swap as normal. There is Forza Aero, which actually doesn't look that awful, although I'm surprised there isn't a splitter all the way across the middle. And on the back, same sort of thing, it's just a little lip, so it doesn't look as bad as it could have done. And otherwise, it's all the usual sort of upgrades. Rather surprisingly, it doesn't have a race transmission or race brakes from standard. It is on race suspension already, though. Can't change that, and there's a few engine-y upgradey bits as well as normal. I also found it wasn't even on street tyres from standard, strangely, so I fitted it with sport tyres. Anything more than that put it into S2 class, unfortunately. They're full width at the rear and standard width at the front. I also gave it a race gearbox so I could tune out that terrible lag in first gear, or at least that was the idea. However, after upgrades that gear became much shorter and didn't really need anything doing to it. I also fitted some race brakes. I then put on some different wheels and increased their size to reduce PI. I wouldn't usually use this covered style, but it kind of works on a racing car, I think. They often did have covered wheels like that for aerodynamic purposes. This meant I was able to squeeze in a race intake and race ignition to give it a bit more power, as 600 isn't really enough in S1, although this only gives it 642, which still isn't really enough. And it unfortunately now weighs a massive 1 kilo more than it did when we started. Anyway, after these upgrades and a quick livery, I wasn't at all ready for S1 class open racing, so I began. I started in race 2 out of 3 of the series, around the lookout circuit and was given a rather lovely pole position, which I immediately lost. The car felt slightly too slow off the line and very understeery still, which wasn't actually that surprising given the tyres it was on, and it still had the same downforce, probably. Anyway, I somehow finished third, although potentially could have got second if I had driven slightly better. Next up was the Jonas Blanca Sprint, where I started last, in contrast to the previous race. However, after a not particularly good drive from me, I was effectively gifted second place by a crashing Audi. Anyway, as that was only 2 races, I entered a second set of them, starting with the Cathedral Circuit, with me on pole again, where I immediately fell to 6th, then went back to 2nd, and was then brutally murdered by an out-of-control McLaren, who, throughout this, I realised, can't drive, basically. I then had an excellent battle with a Lambo over 4th, which was actually quite low down the order. There were only 6 cars in the race, and I ended up last after a couple of mistakes. The second race was then the Cathedral Circuit, where I started last and finished last, after many ridiculous wall slowdowns, which is a theme of Horizon Open. And finally we moved on to the Vulcan Sprint, where I got stuck behind a Mercedes and had to deal with a laggy McLaren, until I eventually missed a checkpoint, and then missed another one trying to catch up, at which point I decided I should quit Open and not even bother finishing that race. So there we go, that is going to do it for a first look at the Schuppan here on Forza Horizon 5. It's a very cool and rare car to have added, so I'm pleased to see it here. It drives reasonably well from standard, but does suffer from understeer, and isn't going to be all that competitive upgraded, even with a good set of upgrades, unlike the ones I've very quickly thrown on. It's going to be kind of average. You can still finish okay in Horizon Open, mostly because a lot of people can't drive, but I don't think it's ever going to be breaking any records, let's say. So yeah, not necessarily going to be all that useful, but like I say, very cool to have this added, and is probably one of my favourite cars from the expansion, apart from maybe the Brabham, which is also pretty cool. But anyway, there we go. That is going to do it for a first look at the Schuppan 962CR. So thank you very much for watching. Do let me know which of the cars from the expansion you'd potentially like me to take a look at next, and I'll be back with the next video very soon.